This is one of the most important artifacts to the U.S. Air Force. One might even argue it might even be the most important. It's debatable. But this is tremendously significant because it is a national icon. It goes to the heart of why the Air Force is a separate service, that air power is decisive. It represents the service and sacrifice of the thousands of airmen who fought not just in Europe but across the globe in World War II. So with all of that context, it's hard to argue that this is not one of our most important, most significant artifacts. We're standing here in the restoration facility at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, and behind me is the most important restoration project going on here at the museum, the Memphis Belle. When the Memphis Belle rolled off the production lines at Boeing, it was another B-17F, which was a little more advanced version than some of the earlier B-17s. It was slated to go over to Europe to fight in the burgeoning strategic bombing campaign going on there. The strategic bombing campaign in Europe was absolutely essential to our war effort, and it's important to point out that there was no guarantee that it was going to work. It was a somewhat new concept that had not been proven really anywhere. This concept came out during World War I that air power could be decisive. Air power alone could win wars. Air power could go behind enemy lines, bomb strategic targets like enemy factories, enemy oil facilities, all the things that are necessary to wage modern war. So the idea that we had in World War II was we would produce these B-17s and other strategic bombing aircraft, and we would strike those targets in Europe that would halt the German war machine. But again, there was no guarantee that it was going to work. And the Memphis Belle went over to Europe at this time when that concept was being forged.
The Memphis Belle has been in the restoration shop since October of 2005. Some of the first steps that we did was start removing coatings and taking the airplane apart further to discover any corrosion or any damage or anything like that so we could start building the airplane back up. It's not unlike a lot of other things where one of the first steps is to stabilize and start building on a good foundation. And during that coating removal process, we discovered that there was all kinds of names and dates of people that had etched their name on the airplane. Some of it took place while it was on its war bond tour, and some of it took place while it was on display in Memphis. Once the coatings are removed and the airframe's assessed, the next step is to go in and do the repairs to the airframe. There was a fair amount of corrosion on this aircraft because it sat outside for several decades. They were never designed to last 70+ years. These aircraft were made to last typically just a few years, so the fact that it was in as good a shape as it was is a testament to the engineering back at the time frame it was built.
The Memphis Belle's first mission was on November 7th, 1942, against a target in France. Now it's important to note, when the Memphis Belle flew that mission in November 7th, that we had no ground forces in France. D-Day was long ways away, till the summer of 1944. The day after the Memphis Belle flew its mission, we landed troops in Africa who would go on to fight all the way across Africa and go into Italy. So, how can we strike at the German war machine at this time? It would be with aircraft like this, a B-17. The Memphis Belle has significance on many different levels. Perhaps one level is simply its fame. The Memphis Belle has been the subject of 2 motion pictures, one during the war by William Wyler, famous producer and director, and also another movie in the early 1990s. When the Memphis Belle finished its tour, it became a symbol of bomber crews finishing 25 missions. That was the length of a tour at the time, was 25 combat missions. Now there were many crews that were not finishing their tours. We were losing many airplanes. So they made the Memphis Belle kind of the symbol of finishing a tour. The Memphis Belle was the first B-17 to finish 25 missions in Europe and return back to the States.
Whenever this aircraft is completely restored, it will be restored to static condition. It will not be a flyer. And there's a lot of different reasons why we don't do that. But one of the really important things is that we will have all the systems installed and hooked up. All the flight controls will operate. We will not have the engines completely overhauled. They will be done for cosmetic reasons, for display reasons. And there's a couple different reasons why we wouldn't make this aircraft a flyer. One of the considerations is money. To make an aircraft functioning, it's exponentially more expensive to restore than to make it a static. And another, this being the icon, a national icon, it would be irresponsible on our part to take the risk on something malfunctioning and destroying the artifact.
One important question, or big question, that people ask is, why is it called the Memphis Belle? Well, it was the girlfriend of the aircraft commander, the main pilot, and his name is Robert Morgan. And his girlfriend, Margaret Polk, is from Memphis. And there's some wonderful, wonderful stories of as he was training in the U.S. and he got the aircraft, he flew to where she was and things like that. And they had this wartime romance. And then as far as the artwork, it's an artwork from a pinup girl. And it was painted by one of the folks that were in the group, that were in the unit, but it's based on a pinup girl drawing. So that's how it got the name Memphis Belle and got the artwork. Another thing too is that the Memphis Belle is an excellent example of something that is almost uniquely American, and that's nose art. When you look at the militaries around the world, you think of being regimented and almost impersonal, you know, rows and rows of identical troops all marching, or airplanes flying in formation. You don't think of individualism. And one thing that's almost uniquely American is this idea of nose art, where they personalize their aircraft. This is my girlfriend, or this is what I'm interested in, or this is where I'm from. You know, nose art is deeply personal. And you do find nose art on aircraft of some other nations, but never to the degree that you have with American aircraft. And that wonderful American tradition continues to today. So the Memphis Belle is another wonderful example of something that's almost uniquely American.
One of the biggest challenges we face with this aircraft in particular is getting all the details right. And that's where we have to interface with the research department to assist us in identifying what the correct componentry was on the aircraft. We weren't fortunate enough to receive this airplane right after its 25th mission, so we have to rely on historical documents to get the aircraft back the way it was during its 25 missions. The challenge with that is that these aircraft, they were making improvements to them almost constantly. So getting all the details right is very difficult, and it's one of those things that's very important to us to have it exactly as it flew its 25th, and so we rely heavily on our research department to provide us that information.
This is the rudder off the Memphis Belle, and we're replacing the cotton skin that goes on it. It's a fabric skin, and all of the control surfaces are covered with this fabric. There are 5 control surfaces on the aircraft. There's the rudder, and then there's 2 elevators, and then 2 ailerons out on the wings. And there's about 600 square feet of fabric on the B-17. A lot of folks don't understand that it's actually covered with fabric and not metal. Now the rest of the airplane is covered with metal, but the control surfaces are covered with fabric. When they were manufacturing these airplanes, the folks that did this over and over, they did just one step at a time, and they only had to learn one step, and I'm sure they did it much more quickly than we do. And we have to recapture those old skills that were used during those days, and there's a little trial and error till we get up to speed on each step, and so the process takes quite a while and it's quite labor intensive, although I'm sure during war times that they cranked them out pretty quick. We really feel a connection with the folks that used these artifacts back years ago, and it's sobering to realize what they went through and the price that they paid, and we really feel a connection with working on the same old artifact that they used.
I think it's worth talking about the crew as well. You know, essentially without a crew, this is just a big hunk of aluminum. It takes skill, expertise, bravery for this to be an effective machine of war. Leading the crew was Robert Morgan, and he was really, really interesting. Typically, you would think a bomber pilot would be they fly the aircraft straight and level, you know, that kind of straight ahead kind of thinking, but Robert Morgan flew this airplane in some ways more like a fighter pilot did, which was unusual. There was one mission in particular, a German fighter was coming in head on, and he pulled back on the yoke and got the nose up so they wouldn't be hit, and it ended up that the German fighter hit the tail, but even so, that was kind of an unusual maneuver. He just was a very aggressive kind of pilot, which was a little unusual because these bomber formations were all set. The whole point with these bomber formations is you hold formation, especially on the bombing run. There's no big evasive maneuvers, or the whole thing would fall apart, and yet you have this kind of aggressive personality. But the rest of the crew is highly skilled. There is no way that they would have finished their tour without being excellent at their jobs. They had to have a little bit of luck too, because there's no way to dodge a shell from a German 88 flat gun. But the crew was cohesive, they were tight, they were skilled. But again, the 10-member crew of the Memphis Belle did not fly all of their missions together. There was kind of a core crew of about 6 or 7 or 8 that flew most of their missions together. But there were some others that flew 2 or 3 missions on the Belle. There was one that flew 1 mission on the Belle. So the crew was not completely intact through the tour. But this core group that came back and did the war bond tour, what's interesting about this group is after they did the war bond tour, they were ready to go back and serve. So many of them went and flew combat tours, like for instance, Robert Morgan went to the Pacific and flew a B-29, flew a combat tour on a B-29 bombing targets in Japan. So they could very easily have rested on their laurels, came back, they flew a combat tour, they survived it, they would have been perfectly just in staying home, going to a training base. But most of them didn't want to do that. They wanted to get back in the fight, which tells you something about their fighting spirit and their courage.
The Memphis Belle right now is currently about 80% completed as far as the structural repairs are concerned. We've identified most of the defects, we've repaired the majority of them, and the next steps are going to be painting the aircraft and installing the systems back inside the aircraft. And we anticipate that we'll complete that within the next couple years. The restoration on this aircraft has been probably one of the more difficult restorations to do, simply because of trying to get the configuration back the way it was during the 25th missions, and the lack of documentation on some of those configurations. The airframe condition was actually, again, pretty decent considering the age of the airplane. And I mean, for us to have the privilege to work on such an iconic aircraft, I think is a career opportunity for everybody in restoration.
A question many people have is, why is the restoration of the Memphis Belle so important? And it's a very simple question to answer. It is because of the importance of the Memphis Belle itself, its history, its provenance, what it means to the nation, and what it means to the U.S. Air Force.